Yes.
And all you gotta do is put some season salt on them off. Put some season salt and some black peppers on them off. And some onions. And then bounce back. And you make them a sandwich. And you talking about fake nutty ball. Because after that divorce, she was just looking bad.
Matthew! What? Are you into me?
Ain't nobody bigger. Ice all on my neck. Make your body shiver. Fit that I got on. Don't come out till December. I get money every summer, spring, fall, winter. Every day I ball. If I fall, I'm a lifter. BVS stones. I ain't never got my shit up. I be on some other shit. Y'all be on some sucker shit. They don't know my government. You can call me the big one. Mama, face card never on decline. Mama, big bitch and I'm still fine.
Seems like look at yourself in the mirror like what the fuck? Damn, I look good. Can't nobody feel like I could. Yeah, oh.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but
No, it won't. Because I'm strong.
We that old? That's crazy. Yeah.
You too, Julie.
you never heard this before.
I feel like I have. I also haven't at the same time.
Sticks and stones may break my bones.
That's about what I remember.
Talissa and Zoe sitting in a tree.
Okay, I assist. Yeah, I know.
Go ahead and factory reset this other phone.
Oh.
Shit, dude, huh?
That one.
Yeah, ing. Keep going.
Did you take that out the window still? I really hope so. Because if not, I'm not gonna have no drink to even come back into. Okay, so that's all right.
First comes love.
Then
Is she asleep?
No.
Oh, great. Because I honestly don't feel like drinking Kool-Aid right now. I don't want to drink Kool-Aid. And it's 10:39. Oh, no, I should have brought the bitch over when I came anyway.
What is it?
My drink.
I know. Starting to snow a little bit, y'all.
What we think? The Clyde's cool? No. So from what Kaylee was saying, they saying that they running out of snow days.
The school.
Yeah, so we might not. They might not decline it. What?
You don't get 15.
So no, they're not. I mean, they're getting close, but they're not. They ain't right out.
Oh, Lord.
I wouldn't waste my time going to school for this shit.
You don't know what we finna wake up to though, because temperature just gonna drop
It ain't
more.
stuck nowhere.
It just started.
There's been so many different counties that snowed in already that ain't stuck in a single one.
All right.
And Warristown just got the snow. Instead of just a little bit of flurries, it stopped.
I'm not.
Damn, already? That's crazy. How?
Update.
Yes.
yeah. the baby.
No.
All right, cool. I got 30%.
Marriage.
Oh.
They left without me. They
Do this every year.
It's snowing more and more.
Damn.
Look at that shit. Oh, Lord.
She had redeemed herself. Them last work sessions wasn't good, Cardi. Her back gonna hurt after this concert. No, she was stripper though. Shouldn't be too bad.
The way y'all have been hounding me in the comments about them videos, y'all sick. Y'all sick. But I ain't no better than y'all. Let me tell y'all something. Body control. I personally feel like Cardi need to keep it. Just keep it for the people, Cardi. Keep it for the people, cause damn, probably make a gay nigga reconsider. Cardi, Drea, and Jada got the best asses in the game. Argue with your mom, don't argue with me. I said what I said.
Jada.
So y'all also waiting on the full review of the tour. It's coming, y'all. It's coming.
Who the fuck is Jada?
Came to the party.
You can't hear me? I said lies.
Huh? Y'all just think we live in this motherfucker, huh?
Oh, man.
No. Just got back in the car.
I've been in my room for hours.
Like, what the fuck? Where have you been? I hate being cold.
You cold?
Yes, I'm very cold.
I got you.
Huh?
I got you.
It's cool. It's nice. It's freezing. I have low iron in my neck.
I know.
So I'm just going, I'm liable to be cold. And then when I'm cold, my whole body feel like a fucking, hurt. Somebody stabbing the shit out of me.
I'm sorry.
It's cool. Chilling and snowing. He can never make a snow angel with me. Spit a snowman, fuck no. I had to have extra hand warmers. Every time I touch the snow, it's gonna melt. Fuck.
If you ever wanted to go to Mexico, don't.
Mexico still alive?
No.
Okay.
The cartel that's fucking destroying Mexico right now
Why?
because the army killed their gang leader.
Because, damn. So you're destroying your own hometown because of something that the army did, and the army packs up and leaves, which is kind of retarded if you think about it, because you, at the end of the day, you're gonna be the one paying for it and cleaning it all
Man,
up.
the cartel
That's
run
stupid.
The cartel run.
Cartel don't run Mexico.
Shit.
That's why their leader got killed.
What?
The fuck if they ran Mexico, their leader would've got
Why
killed.
do you think it's a war between the government and the cartel in Mexico?
Shit, I don't keep up with all of that. Don't live there. That's crazy though.
They've been destroying planes and snow shit. Them motherfuckers.
Thank y'all.
Why? Jesus. Bruh. Mix. Stupid.
Couldn't help it.
Yeah, never mind. I should show their ass. I should show your YouTube.
Please say your command.
Damn, I thought you was a stag. What's a cat?
Try saying a device name like phone or USB. You
This is
can
my
also
Mexico.
say navigation or climate. Main menu. Say a command.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Pretty cow.
Another moo moo.
You're sweet little man. That big ass
I wouldn't be cool.
cow. Yes.
Too big for me.
But I don't like the way their horns are misshapen. One's higher, one's lower. Fuck. I have shit to do.
What?
Close.
Tonight?
Yeah.
Like wash?
Yeah. I gotta wash all my eyes closed really quick. You watch me be doing it for no reason. I completely forgot.
Oh Lord.
Do you want this?
Huh?
Why you keep, bro?
You too.
Yo. I'm gonna put my headphones in.
Taya King.
Stop it, bro.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Y'all finna go in the house.
nice ribbons in his hair. But Fritz has said that he didn't mind this. He preferred these kinds of activities to the more manly activities that young boys were supposed to get involved in. So then Fritz started school, and he was described as quite a reserved, quiet child. He didn't really have any friends his own age. He didn't socialise with any other children apart from his other siblings. He didn't like to place on the sports teams, like, typical boy things. He preferred to hang out with girls, which meant that Fritz did face a little bit of bullying, a little bit of teasing from the other boys in his school. The teachers didn't really have his back either. They just thought that he was a gay dreamer and he needed to man up. So because Fritz needed to man up, he was placed in the care of one of the male teachers at the school, and this male teacher was supposed to show Fritz how to be
what?
I'm taking my
what
thing
ended up
out the
happening
wall.
is that this male teacher
Yeah, if I'm gonna put my
actually
desk right there, I can't have that
sexually
over there.
abused Fritz.
Don't put it back up
He was
nowhere.
only 8 years old.
For real.
This man was
Okay.
sexually assaulted regularly by
I'm gonna need some. What's it? Huh?
Same verse already.
No, I'm gonna need some stuff to cover the holes because one of them got like super bad.
Bro, just check it out. I'll look at it later.
What's
He
that?
started becoming very disruptive in class. He got suspended multiple times from school. He started to get a thrill out of causing fear in other children. He started to tie his sisters up. He would start to bully his sisters and antagonize them. He would also go around his neighborhood late at night and start banging on the windows and doors to scare the residents or whoever was living in that house. But this wasn't the only thing that started to happen as Fritz grew up, because Fritz started to absolutely despise his father. And it was mutual. His father also despised him. Now, Fritz despised his father because he thought that his father was his mom back then. Then his father despised Fritz because he thought Fritz was too girly. He wasn't a man. He wasn't going to grow up into the son that he wanted him to be. Because Fritz, he leaves school at the age of 15 and he immediately enrolls into the military. And it was around this time when Fritz started to explore and discover his sexuality. And he realized he was gay. But again, he is currently in the 1890s at this point. Homosexuality was highly stigmatized and also criminalized back then, which meant that Fritz couldn't be truly open about who he was, and it had a huge impact on him. But not just that, 5 months into his military training, Fritz fell seriously ill. He started collapsing all the time, he was passing out, he was going weak, dizzy, and at first the doctors had no idea what was going on with him. And he was diagnosed with a few different conditions before doctors actually diagnosed him with epilepsy. Fritz actually did see a number of doctors and psychiatrists throughout this case, and he was diagnosed with so many things. At one point, he was even diagnosed with schizophrenia, but because he was diagnosed with epilepsy, he was kicked out of the military, and Fritz was distraught about this, because now he returns home and he has nothing to do. He needs a job, he needs money, which meant that he was forced to work in his dad's factory instead. Now, we know how turbulent their relationship is. Fritz and his dad, they basically hate each other. So the idea that Fritz had to work with his dad was a living nightmare. He was lashing out, misbehaving, but this is also when a darker side of Fritz started to emerge, because this was the moment when Fritz started to sexually abuse young boys. His sexual urges were spiraling out of control, and Fritz kept noticing young boys walking around the neighborhood, and he would start to think about doing despicable things to these young boys. So Fritz started to hang around late at night in his neighborhood. He would lurk in secluded areas like down alleyways, for example, and he would just wait for a young boy to pass him. He would make sure that these young boys, they were on their own, their parents weren't in sight or anything like that. Then he would lure these young boys to another secluded area. He would like to take young boys to cellars before molesting and sexually assaulting these young boys. And he did this repeatedly. It's not actually known how many victims Fritz had at this point. He was sexually assaulting so many young boys, and I'm talking children, I'm talking like under the ages of 10, some of these children. But these young boys, they were too scared to report Fritz. They were too scared to say anything, even to their parents, to anyone. Because number one, they didn't think that anyone would believe them. But number two, it was taboo to talk about anything related to sex. So these young boys, they never told anybody until one of the victims did report the assault to their mother. The mother then reported the assault of her son to the police. Fritz was then arrested and thrown in jail. But the police, they weren't really too concerned. Fritz only served a very short sentence in prison and then he was released. And then Fritz just went back to his daily routine of sexually abusing young boys because no one seemed to care. So now possibly hundreds of more young boys were now victims of Fritz. 6 months later, Fritz was actually arrested again. But this time he wasn't thrown in jail. He was actually placed in a mental health facility. And once Fritz arrived at this mental health facility, he did not have a very good time at all. Again, he was evaluated by psychiatrists and he was deemed, quote, incurably deranged. And back in the late 1800s in mental institutions in Germany, if someone was deemed deranged or incurably deranged, they were basically thrown in a room, locked up, and the key was thrown away because it was thought that you can't help them, so what's the point? What's the point of even treating them like a human being? But what is just absolutely crazy is that after spending 7 months in the mental health facility, Fritz managed to escape, which I'm like, what? He managed to escape and he fled to Switzerland. It is not known if he was assisted in any way, but I assume he was. But he made it all the way to Switzerland and his mom started to send him money to Switzerland so he could hide out in Switzerland. Open up their own fishmongers. And Fritz was living life as a fishmonger. Open up their own fishmongers. And Fritz was living life as a fishmonger. He spent a lot of time gutting and filleting and selling fish, skills that he would later need, unfortunately. So currently, everything is going great for Fritz. Erna had just fallen pregnant with their second child, but that would not last for long because Erna had decided that she had had enough. She didn't want to be with Fritz anymore. She just didn't like it. So she calls off the engagement. And because the fishmonger business was in her name, she also took the business from Fritz. She also took their home and the 2 children, leaving Fritz with nothing. And I can't say for sure, but I don't think Fritz ever sees his children again. And that's probably the best. So Fritz's life right now really is completely falling apart. He now has absolutely nothing. He has no job, no money, no fiance, no home. So what does Fritz decide to do? He decides to turn to a life of crime. I mean, he's already a criminal. He's already a paedophile. Let's not forget that. And he was still sexually assaulting boys, by the way, the whole time. Just because they haven't been saying, it did not stop. And it's like, remember, he has his own children at this point as well. So God knows what he possibly could have done to them. But this is when Fritz becomes deeply entrenched in the German criminal underground. He started to make a lot of dodgy connections. He started committing petty theft, burglaries. He also spent some time as a con artist. He set up multiple fraudulent businesses where he would essentially just con people out of their money. Around this time as well, Fritz was in and out of jail on various different offences, such as assault, larceny, embezzlement. And then to top things off, Fritz also became a professional grave robber. And this is now Fritz's life, full of criminal activity. And now we get to Fritz in his 30s. This is when his sexual assault of young boys just continues to get worse and worse. It is now escalating because he is not only sexually assaulting young boys on the streets, he is now also luring them back to his apartment. He would always choose vulnerable young boys, runaways, or young boys that were homeless that did need a hot meal. And he would bring them into his apartment and he would give them a warm meal. And then he would sexually assault these young boys over and over again. And he would sometimes keep these young boys in his apartment for days at a time before then letting them go. And then these young boys were so scared to ever report anything about Fritz. But Fritz was now also expanding his range and his type of victims. He wasn't only targeting young boys anymore. It was then teenage boys and older teenage boys, but also male sex workers. And then just another crazy turn of events for this case, Fritz randomly becomes a police informant. All of a sudden, Fritz became very chummy with the local police department. He started telling police officers that he could help them out and catch the bad guys, give them information. And the time period that we are in right now is just after World War I. The police departments in the whole of Germany were in a terrible state. The country was in a lot of debt. They had pretty much no resources, and the police department especially were desperate for any kind of help. And Fritz thought to himself, I am deeply entrenched in the criminal underground. I have a lot of information on a lot of dodgy people. I can work as a police informant, earn myself some money, become good friends with police officers, then they would trust Fritz, and then Fritz would be able to get away with his own criminal activity right under police officers' noses because they would never suspect Fritz. And it was kind of a genius plan because it worked. This is very important to today's case, the fact that Fritz became a police informant. This is essentially how he was able to get away with all of his crimes, especially the murders, for so long. But then all of this power, it really did go to Fritz's head because he started making citizens arrest himself. He started going around the neighborhood, around train stations, started thinking that he could lay down the law himself. And he had the police wrapped around his little finger. And Fritz was loving life. He was confident. He was so emboldened by all of this. He thought there is no way the police are ever going to suspect me of committing all of these atrocious crimes when I'm their best informant. He thought that he could get away with any crime that he wanted. So now his crimes become even worse. Now Fritz realized that he had other sexual urges and desires when he had these young boys and young men in his control. He realized that he had a strong sexual desire to bite down on these young boys' necks. I am not talking about playful biting, non-aggressive biting. I'm not talking about that. Fritz wanted to sink his teeth into their necks. He wanted to see blood. And these were not just thoughts and fantasies in Fritz's mind because he actually wanted to carry these out. And this is now where the deadbeat killing spree of Fritz Harman begins. Because in September of 1918, 38-year-old Fritz went looking for a victim, a young boy, like he always did. And this is when he came across a 17-year-old boy called Friedel. He spotted Friedel in a nearby cafe, and Fritz went in, he sat by the boy, started up a conversation. Now, Friedel told Fritz that he was a runaway, and Fritz was like, great, this is my perfect victim. Fritz told Friedel that he was a police officer and that he could look out for him. This was a tactic that Fritz used all of the time. He would tell his victims that he was a police officer, someone that they could trust, rely on. And the two of them went back to Fritz's apartment. They both smoked for a little bit, they had a conversation, but this time Fritz was losing control and he was becoming more and more aggressive. He started touching Friedel inappropriately without his consent, and when Friedel tried to push Fritz off of him, this is when Fritz grabbed his throat, pinned him down, and started to rape him. And as Fritz was carrying out this sexual assault, this is when he got the desire to bite into Friedel's throat. And Fritz has had this urge for a while, and up until this point, he's been able to restrain himself, but no longer. So Fritz bared his teeth, bit down on Friedel's throat, right into his Adam's apple. And Friedel's neck started pouring with blood. He was gasping for air. He must have been in so much pain. I can't even imagine. And Fritz became instantly aroused by the blood, what he had done. So Fritz just kept biting down onto Friedel's throat. He also then started to drink the blood from Friedel's neck. And this aroused him even more, until eventually Fritz sunk his teeth into Friedel's windpipe, got a good grip of it, before ripping it clean out with his teeth. I can't even wrap my head around how anyone can do that, but oh my god, to murder somebody by biting into their neck and ripping out their windpipe with their teeth is absolutely horrifying. That poor boy. And this is the moment when 17-year-old Friedel lost his life. And that is just an awful, awful way to go. And then after the murder, Fritz got straight to work. He was not messing around at all. He pulled out a load of knives and he started dismembering Friedel's body. He also decapitated him and stored various body parts around his home. And then over the next few days, Fritz would place various body parts in a suitcase and walk to the local cemetery and bury the body parts in the cemetery. Now, it wasn't too long until Friedel's friends reported him missing to the police. They told the police that Friedel had been hanging around with a strange police officer, and they were able to give the police Fritz's home address. Police officers turned up at his apartment to search the place for Friedel. And this is where this case should end, because there are still body parts in Fritz's apartment. The decapitated head of Friedel is still in the apartment. Fritz has actually hidden the decapitated head in the oven behind newspapers. So he hasn't really hidden it that well. So police officers should be able to find the head of Friedel, and that is where this case should end. But unbelievably, when the police turned up at Fritz's apartment, they barged in, and Fritz was currently sexually assaulting another 13-year-old boy, which is possibly a potential murder victim to Fritz. So the police arrest Fritz for the sexual assault of the 13-year-old boy. They took him down to the station, and again, I just feel like case closed. The police have arrested Fritz, yes, on a different assault, but still they've arrested him. This is grounds to search his apartment, and therefore, they will find the decapitated head. But they don't. The police search the apartment, but they don't exactly do a thorough job, and they completely miss the decapitated head of Friedel in the oven. So therefore, the police did not charge Fritz with the murder of Friedel. Friedel was still just a missing boy. Instead, he was charged with assault and battery of a minor for the 13-year-old boy, and he was sent to prison for only 9 months. So that was Fritz's first murder. Now, something very significant happens after this first murder, because just after Fritz gets out of prison after serving 9 months for sexual assault and battery, he meets a young man called Hans Grantz, and Hans would soon become Fritz's accomplice / sidekick. Now, Hans was 18 years old, he was a runaway, and to be honest, Hans is literally the perfect victim for Fritz. He was a runaway, he had an argument with his dad, so no one was going to come looking for him, he was currently homeless, and he was working as a sex worker. Now, Hans became aware of Fritz because Fritz frequently visited sex workers. So Hans was the one to introduce himself to Fritz to solicit business. And one thing led to another, and the two of them became best friends. Now, I can't help but wonder if Hans was a potential victim when they first met, because I'm convinced that he was. Like I've said, he was literally the perfect victim for Fritz. But Fritz became almost obsessed with Hans. They formed quite a close bond. Fritz would invite Hans over to his apartment all of the time. They became best of friends. Then apparently they became lovers, even though Hans has said himself that he was straight. So again, I'm not quite sure about this relationship. I don't know the ins and outs and the details. Was Fritz just paying Hans as a client of his? Who knows? But Fritz also invited Hans to live in his apartment. And over time, Fritz actually said that Hans became almost like a son to him, which makes me feel very sick, because one minute they're lovers and then the next moment you're seeing this 18-year-old boy as your son. It's messed up. But Fritz apparently well and truly fell in love with Hans. He felt a duty of care to protect him, look after him. And they had a very turbulent relationship. Neighbours would say that they would hear shouting, arguments, fights all of the time. They would also see Hans storm out of the apartment, but he would always return. So then 4 years pass. Fritz goes in and out of prison on various different offences, and he remains in this somewhat of a relationship with Hans the entire time. And as far as we are aware, during those 4 years, Fritz did not murder anyone. At least it hasn't been confirmed. So I wouldn't be surprised if he did. There has just been no confirmed murder victims in that time. But now we get to February of 1923, and his murderous ways make a comeback, and it's even worse than before. Because one day, Fritz goes out onto the streets prowling for a victim. Again, this is very normal behaviour for Fritz. But this is when Fritz came across a 17-year-old boy called Fritz Frank. He invited the 17-year-old boy back to his apartment. Now, back at the apartment, this is obviously where Hans lives. And Hans was in the apartment with 2 female acquaintances. And apparently one of these female acquaintances was Hans' lover. And it's just all very complicated started, it just seems like everyone is having sex with everyone, if I'm being completely honest. But this is when Hans starts to become involved in the murders. So anyway, Fritz returns to the apartment with this 17-year-old boy, Fritz Frank, and the group are chatting, they are having a few drinks, and this is when Hans says to one of his female acquaintances, he's going to be trampled on today, meaning the 17-year-old boy. Now, the woman had no idea what Hans meant by this, but not too long after, Hans and
It's not a shelf, it's a bed.
leave the apartment, leaving Fritz alone with 17-year-old Fritz Frank. Fritz now being alone with his victim, it wasn't long until he started sexually assaulting him. And then it wasn't too long until he bit into the 17-year-old's throat, and he kept biting until he saw blood. He drank blood, and then he kept biting until he pulled out the windpipe with his teeth, taking 17-year-old Fritz Frank's life. And it's just so awful. Like, what is wrong with this man? Like, why is he biting the windpipes out of young boys? And later on, the same evening, Hans returns to the apartment, finding Fritz with the naked, bloody corpse of the 17-year-old boy on a bed. And it is clear that this young boy has obviously been murdered. And this is when Hans looks at Fritz and just very calmly says, "When should I come back again?" Before calmly turning around, leaving the apartment, and leaving Fritz to do whatever he wants to do to this 17-year-old boy's corpse. And I'm like, what the actual hell? He is not fazed at all. He literally just said, "When should I come back? When will you be finished?" basically. So Hans hasn't murdered this young boy himself, but he's clearly okay with it. It's almost like he was just pretending that he never even saw the dead body of this boy. So then the next day, Hans and the two women that he was with the previous day, they all return to the apartment. Now, the two women, one of them notices the young boy's clothes on the bed, but the boy is nowhere to be seen. They ask Fritz, what happened to the boy? Like, where is he? His clothes are here, but he's not here. And this is when Fritz angrily replied, "Oh, he left. He's gone traveling. He's gone back to Hamburg." But the women didn't believe him. And after they left the apartment, they went straight to the police. And again, I'm like, this is the second murder now. This again should be case closed. But unfortunately, when the women went to the police station, they spoke to a detective. And the detective that they spoke to was friends with Fritz. He was one of the detectives that Fritz was working for as an informant. So the detective took down the notes that the women told him. He ordered a search of Fritz's apartment. He went through the motions of what he was supposed to do as a police officer. However, he didn't actually want to find anything incriminating because Fritz was too valuable as an informant. So in the end, the detective said that there was no evidence found in the apartment, which there more than likely was, and then the investigation was closed. And this is what I mean when I said that Fritz had the police department in his area wrapped around his little finger, because he truly does. So because he now is so confident that he's just going to get away with murder, this is when he launches into a relentless and brutal killing spree. And I truly, truly mean that, because just 5 weeks later, on the 20th of March, Fritz finds another 17-year-old victim called Wilhelm. He found Wilhelm at a train station, and he was a runaway. And this is when he follows the same playbook that he always does. He introduced himself as a police officer, someone that he could trust. He invited Wilhelm back to his apartment for a hot meal, a place to sleep for the night. But as soon as they got back to the apartment, this is sadly when Fritz started to sexually assault the young boy. And then it wasn't long until he sunk his teeth into his neck. He became incredibly aroused, and he kept biting down until he reached the windpipe, and Wilhelm sadly lost his life. And afterwards, Fritz dismembered the body and dumped the body parts in a nearby river. And unfortunately, no one came looking for the 17-year-old boy. And then just a couple of months later, Fritz committed 2 more murders in the exact same way. The first victim was a 16-year-old boy called Roman, and then the second victim was a 19-year-old boy called Hans. They were both murdered after being sexually assaulted, and Fritz bit down into their neck until they were dead. Now, Fritz has a very, very specific MO. He follows the same pattern for every single murder, down to a T. His victims were pretty much always boys in their teenage years to late teenage
Are those bottom
years,
drawers for the
he
bed?
always
They
targeted boys
are.
that were vulnerable in some sort of way.
I'm about to say for a little bit.
Their
You are
social
talking a little bit to me.
circumstances, most of them were homeless or runaways. His favourite place to search for victims was actually train stations, and he would always introduce himself to these boys as a police officer, someone that they could trust. And he would lure them back to his apartment on the promise of a hot meal and a bed to stay in. And to these vulnerable young boys that were homeless or a runaway, the idea of a warm meal and a roof over their head for at least one night was very appealing. Now, how long he kept the boys at his apartment did vary. Some boys he took them back to his apartment and he murdered them straight away. But then some boys he did keep around for a few days. He let them carry out these odd jobs that he had. It's almost like he was using them for child labour before he murdered them. But then when he did murder these young boys, he would always do it in the same way. He would always hold them down, sexually assault them, rape them, violently bite down on their neck. Their blood would pour everywhere. He would drink blood from their necks. He would become very sexually aroused by the whole thing. And he would keep biting down on their necks until he found the windpipe. And then he would rip the windpipe out of their neck with his teeth. And he did this until they died of asphyxiation. And Fritz came up with a little name for his method of killing. He called it his love bite. And then after his two most recent victims, this is when Fritz came up with a new process on how he was going to get rid of the victims' bodies, which is just absolutely sickening. Because the first thing that Fritz would do was pour himself a mug of black coffee to prepare himself for what he was about to do. And then he would lay the body on the floor. He would place a cloth over the face because he didn't want to look at the face of the victim that he had just murdered. He clearly wants to dissociate himself from what he has just done before taking a knife and making two large cuts into the stomach area. This is when he would use his bare hands to scoop out the intestines and place them in a bucket. He would then grab a towel and shove it into the hole that he had made into the stomach where the intestines were, and he would try and soak up all of the blood. He would then make 3 cuts between the victim's shoulders and ribs, and then he would push down as hard as he could until the ribs snapped clean from the shoulder joints. This meant that Fritz had easy access to all of the internal organs, and he would take his time getting his hands in there and removing all of the internal organs. He would remove the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and he would chop them all off and then place them in the same bucket as the intestines, before then severing the arms and legs from the torso, which then he would meticulously strip the flesh from the bones until the bones were completely clean. This is why I said his time as a fishmonger and him gutting fish and everything would have helped him with his crimes. And then he was just shoveling all of these bits of flesh into wax cloth bags, and the sight, the smell, everything must have been awful. And Fritz ended up flushing down the toilet a lot of the flesh and the organs, and then he dumped some of the other flesh and organs, and just what he couldn't get down the toilet, he would dump in the nearby river. And Fritz has actually said himself that he hated this process, but his passion for murder outweighed his distaste for dismemberment. And then the final part of dismembering the body, and the most time-consuming, was decapitating the head. And once he had done this, Fritz would use a small knife to strip all of the flesh from the skull and flush the flesh down the toilet. He would then take the skull, wrap it in rags, place it downwards on a pile of straw before taking an axe and smashing the skull into small pieces. He would then take out the brain, chop up the brain, place it in the same bucket with the rest of the organs and the intestines. And in the dead of night, he would just carry this bucket of organs down to his nearby river and just dump them into the river. And organs would literally just be floating down the river, just like there, for anyone to see. He would also dispose of the bones in the river as well on separate occasions. And Fritz felt like he had this process down, the whole murder, the dismemberment, everything. It was just routine for him, and he was getting away with it. So now the murder's just going to overdrive. On the 9th of June, Fritz and Hans actually moved into a new apartment, and just 2 weeks later, their 13-year-old neighbour goes missing, who was a young boy. And of course, Fritz abducted and murdered this 13-year-old neighbour. And I just want to vulnerable. This young boy, he had a family, he had a roof over his head, wasn't homeless, wasn't a runaway, had people to report him missing, and he's a neighbour, so could easily be linked back to Fritz. But Fritz just got away with murder again. And with the murder of his neighbour, this is when Fritz actually starts to keep trophies from his victims. He kept the boy's skull cap and braces in his apartment. 2 months later, 18-year-old Heinrich went missing. He was last seen in the cinema by his aunt, and once again, this was the work of Fritz. Then just 1 month later, 17-year-old Paul went missing whilst he was travelling through Hanover. Again, he was a victim of Fritz. Fritz has now murdered 8 young boys and men, 7 of which have been in the last 6 months. And the police are not doing a single thing, and it's so frustrating because Fritz has been linked to the missing boys, especially if the first 2, but the police are doing absolutely nothing to find all of these missing boys. Because in 1923, which is the year we're currently at in this case, in Hanover alone, 600 teenage boys were reported missing. So it was pretty much an epidemic of missing teenage boys. So this was a perfect cover for Fritz, because it seems like Fritz wasn't the only predator on the streets of Hanover at this time. Combined with the fact that Fritz is also friends with the police, and the police don't want to investigate Fritz either because he's just too much of a good informant, Fritz felt like he was going to be able to get away with these murders forever. On the 30th of September, Fritz lured a 17-year-old boy called Richard to his apartment under the pretenses that Fritz had a job for Richard. But once again, Fritz had found another victim. Fritz sexually assaulted him, bit into his neck until he reached his windpipe, and took the life of 17-year-old Richard. On the 12th of October, Fritz found another victim, 16-year-old Wilhelm. He took the 16-year-old boy back to his apartment and did the same thing, sexually assaulted the young boy and murdered him. Just 2 weeks later, Fritz took the lives of 2 young boys in the space of 3 days. This was a 15-year-old boy called Harmon and a 13-year-old boy called Hans. These murders are escalating. The cool-down period between the murders is getting shorter and shorter. And Fritz, his confidence was going through the roof because now he was also looking to profit from the murders. So he would strip the boys clean of all of their clothes, their shoes, belts, anything that they had on them, and then he would start to sell the possessions of his victims to the highest bidder. He even gave the stolen bicycle from one of his victims to his lover, Hans, who then sold the bike and made a profit from it. Hans, I know I haven't mentioned him in a while, Hans the lover, the sidekick, but he just doesn't care. He seems to be aware of everything and he just doesn't care as long as he profits in some sort of way from these murders. So as far as we're aware, Hans didn't himself participate in the murders, but he's just as complicit because he's just standing by letting Fritz get away with it. But if you think things in this case have been disturbing, wait until you hear what happens next. So Fritz goes on another killing spree, killing 6 young boys who were 17-year-old Adolf, 17-year-old Ernest, 19-year-old Adolf, 20-year-old Heinrich, 19-year-old Willie, and 16-year-old Herman, killing them all in the exact same way as his other victims. And as all of these murders were happening, neighbours were starting to notice some strange activity going on in Fritz's apartment. Because Fritz, all of a sudden, out of the blue, becomes an underground meat dealer. Yeah, I'm not joking. We all know where this is going. So at this point, we are still just after World War I. Poverty was rife in Germany. People were willing to do pretty much anything to save money on especially food, and people needed to eat. So illegal meat sellers especially started to pop up all over the place. And Fritz joined in on this trend. He would sell sausages to neighbours. He would sell mincemeat to neighbours. Everything was always ground into very small, fine pieces. It was always completely boneless. And neighbours started to become very sick from eating this meat. One neighbour became violently sick after they ate what they thought were sheep's intestines. Another neighbour became sick after they ate meat that Fritz claimed was horse meat. And neighbours would quite often see Fritz leaving his home with packages of meat, but they never saw him bringing the meat into his apartment. So where was this meat coming from? And as you have probably already guessed, it is now widely believed that the meat that Fritz was to his neighbours and people in his local area. And it didn't go unnoticed. People reported this dodgy lead to police. There was even a time when two female friends of Hans, remember Hans, he's still there living in the apartment, two female friends of his came to visit him in the apartment, and apparently they saw a pot on a stove that contained a human mouth boiling inside of the pot. And I'm like, what? A human mouth? Like, I'm struggling to even picture that right now. Are they talking about, like, just the lower part of the jaw? Are they talking about the lips? I don't know. All I know is that they saw a human mouth boiling in this pot on the stove. The two women removed the mouth from the pot and took it straight to the police station. But the police took one look at this human mouth and said that it looked like a pig snout. But again, it just seems like anything that is connected to Fritz, the police don't want to touch because they don't want to find anything. Are you gonna fix? Because Fritz is too valuable for them. So Fritz just carries on getting away with murder, as well as possibly selling human meat to unsuspecting victims. And the murder is absolutely ridiculous. Fritz has already murdered and then young boys and men. But now, over the space of the next 5 weeks, Fritz goes on to murder 5 more young boys and men. There was 22-year-old Herman, 16-year-old Alfred, 16-year-old Wilhelm, 18-year-old Robert, and 14-year-old Heinz. But this killing spree, Fritz starts to get a little bit sloppy, and he starts to become quite attached to the young boys and men that he is murdering. It's almost like he is starting to get a guilty conscience. He now started to keep the young boys around for longer in his apartment before he murdered them. It's almost like he wanted to form more of a connection, more of a relationship with the boys. But Fritz was starting to feel incredibly guilty about what he was doing. And I'm just like, well, if you feel that guilty, stop. But he doesn't. Instead, he carries on murdering young boys and men, and after the murders, he actually just starts to cry. He actually collapses onto the victims, puts a cloth over their face so he doesn't have to see them, and he just starts out crying. At this point, Fritz had realised that he was he got such arousal out of especially out of biting the boy's necks and seeing the blood. And it was just too strong. His impulse to do this, he could not stop it. After the murder, Fritz has apparently he was disgusted himself.
This one?
I don't need those things.
Is this case ever going to end? Is he ever
I'm about done now.
going to get caught? Because right now, Fritz has murdered 22 young boys and men in the space of a year, and he has murdered 23 overall. But now it turns out that the police are finally going to catch up to him. Finally. Because on the 17th of May, 1924, 2 children were out playing by a river that Fritz dumped a lot of the body parts and the bones in. And this is when the 2 children came across a human skull. It was taken straight to the police for them to investigate. But as soon as the police saw the human skull, they thought to themselves, it's probably nothing. It's probably just medical students dumping organs and body parts in the river, because that's totally normal. I mean, it probably was for back then, but still, they are not doing anything. A literal human skull has been handed in, and they just don't care. And then just 1 week later, Fritz goes on to murder 2 more young boys, which could have been prevented if the police had just done their job. The first of these 2 victims was a 10-year-old boy called Friedrich, and this was the youngest victim that Fritz had. And then the second victim, Fritz murdered on the very same day. So he really is escalating at this point. And this was a 16-year-old boy who was also named Friedrich. It is just so unbelievable, so tragic. All of these young boys have been murdered. And
You got rolly joints?
And at this point, the locals were completely fed up.
They put some stuff like on the sides?
There's 2 on that side already.
You ain't really put the ones on that
So the
side?
local residents decided to take matters into their
You got to move your bed?
and they
I ain't gonna put
found
them all the way
stuff
out.
of the local river on their
I'm gonna have to clean up my room because them beds come like, if my bed come like tomorrow, like day after tomorrow.
Stay the mattress.
Huh?
Stay the mattress.
This is when they came across
Need a mattress.
hundreds
Man.
of different
What
pieces
about my
of
desk?
human remains. They found so many bones.
Tomorrow?
And they
No, I didn't say that bed was coming tomorrow
could
either.
not ignore this situation any longer. So the police sent a specialist team to search the river themselves. And this is when they found a further 500
Put some of that fish in there.
No.
Wow.
Flesh and organs. And this was
God.
later confirmed by a doctor.
Exactly, it's not even fish.
Yes, it is. That's high-grade fish.
So the
That's what you
police
talking
finally
about.
realised that they
Right.
had a
That's
serial
high-grade
killer on their
fish.
hands, and they
High-
set out to find
high-grade?
the serial
It's a
killer as
high-grade.
soon as possible. But unfortunately, Fritz had one final victim, who was a 17-year-old boy called Eric. Eric told his parents that he was going for a swim in the nearby river, and he was travelling the streets alone when he was picked
You don't
up
like fish
by
now?
police. He
I
was
don't
brought
like
back to
eating
the
it
apartment,
like that.
sexually assaulted, whilst Fritz bit into his neck and tore into his windpipe, instantly taking
Get out of my
Eric's
room, bro.
life. He then dismembered Eric's body and disposed of the
Get out.
pieces. And just a few
gotta wait
days
myself.
later,
do you
that
mean, get out?
and finally the police were about to catch up to Fritz. Because for over a year now, there have been a lot of suspicions around Fritz and his behaviour and his apartment, and neighbours noticed that there was always young boys going into his apartment, let alone
No, you
the
keep
fact
the
that
energy you
Fritz
got.
seemed to have the heat.
Remember, I'm gonna cancel everything.
And neighbours just realised that
Give a damn.
no one ever seemed to leave
What?
that apartment. They
Save
saw
me
boys
some
going
money.
in, but they never saw them coming out. So
What
when the
you
police
mean,
realised
save
that
me
there was
some
Yeah, you don't keep that energy, alright?
people's
Yeah, because
suspicions
you acting
instantly
weird.
turned.
No, you
So
are.
the police decided to
Ow.
look for
Good.
Fritz.
Come on, don't talk
They
to
were
me.
finally
Who you
doing their
talking
job.
to?
So on the
I
night
mean,
of the
because, like, I can't do nothing now, and then when I do something, I'm
and they
wrong.
watched Fritz leave his apartment
Ow.
and make his way over
Hey.
to Hanover train
Ain't
station.
nothing no
And
more.
he seemed to be
Ow.
accompanied
So,
by
I'm just gonna stop caring about
possibly
everything for
another
real.
victim.
Anything,
And once
anything,
Fritz
everything.
was at the
Alright, don't ask me to go nowhere else.
officers saw
Then your
Fritz
ass go
leave
places, go to parties, let you do all types of shit, and you shit you
Mom, I'm
won't.
even talking about that.
What the fuck you talking about, bro?
About the babies.
Okay, be good to them babies, bro.
Yeah, I just said I'm not finna kill baby. I'm not finna kill this day. I'm not finna do
approach
that.
other police officers that were at the train station. So not
They
even the
behave.
police
I'm just finna
other
annoy
police
them.
officers at the train station.
Like,
And
if we
Fritz
just got them
told these
out.
police officers that this
Then
15-year-old
we'd be
boy
good.
was using fake documents and that they should arrest him, which was a load of lies, complete BS. Instead, Carl told the police officers that Fritz had actually been holding him captive for 4 days and raped him repeatedly with a knife to his throat. And the police officers listening to this 15-year-old boy tell them this were astounded. But the undercover police officers were also listening. And this is when they swooped in and finally arrested Fritz Harmon. Finally, it's about goddamn time. Now at this point, everything moves incredibly quickly. Fritz's apartment was searched, and they found that pretty much everywhere, the walls, the floors, the bedding, everything was covered in blood. They questioned the neighbours, and the neighbours said how frequently young boys would go into the apartment and never come out. They also reiterated all of the dodgy meat activity. And also when searching the apartment, this is when the police found a load of possessions that belonged to the victims. So clothing, belts, shoes, everything. And police took all of these possessions and displayed them in the local police station and said to the public, if you are a parent of a missing child, come down to see if any of these possessions belong to your child. And this is how the police tried to identify who the victims of Fritz were. And by using the clothing and the possessions of the victims, the police were able to identify 27 victims. So 27 young men, teenagers and boys. And as you can imagine, the parents were absolutely devastated that their sons had been taken in such a brutal, sadistic way. And as for Fritz, at first he tried to deny everything, but given the sheer amount of evidence that was against him, he soon confessed to everything. He confessed to all of the sexual assaults, the murders, how he disposed of their body parts. And when Fritz was describing the murders, he said that it was just rabid sexual passion, that he couldn't help himself. And he also said, quote, I never intended to hurt those young boys, but I knew that if I got going, something would happen. And so I would throw myself on top of those boys, bite through their Adam's apple, and throttle them at the same time. So according to Fritz, he never actually intended to murder anybody, but he would be seized by, quote, an irresistible urge to bite into their windpipe whilst in the throes of ecstasy. And when Fritz was asked how many victims he had, how many murder victims he had, he simply responded, I don't know, maybe between 50 and 70. You heard that right, between 50 and 70, which is way more victims than the police thought. But in the end, the police only found evidence and the possessions to 27 victims, so that is all that Fritz was charged with. But given the fact that most of his murders happened in 1923 to 1924, given the time period that we are in, I think it would be very easy for Fritz to have had a lot more victims. So I don't know if I believe him where he says between 50 and 70, because that does seem like a lot. I personally do believe that the number is higher than 27. And a few months later, in December of 1924, Fritz finally went to trial, and it took Germany by storm. It is said that the trial was one of the first modern media events in Germany. It also received extensive international press coverage, being described as the most revolting criminal case in German history. This is when Fritz was also given a variety of nicknames, such as the Vampire of Hanover and Wolfman and the Butcher of Hanover. So the trial began, and guess who made a guest appearance in the dock alongside Fritz? His little sidekick, Hans Brands. And this added an extra layer of intrigue to the trial, because everyone was like, oh my god, who is this other man, this man that is apparently Fritz's lover / sidekick? People were wondering how much involvement did Hans have, and Hans was charged as being an accessory to the murders. And during the trial, it appeared that Fritz loved the whole thing. First of all, he was his own defense. He didn't have lawyers, no. He wanted the spotlight for himself, he wanted to defend himself, and he basically used that courtroom as a performance. He loved playing this role, he loved shocking the jury and everyone in the courtroom. He had a smile on his face the whole time, and he was even laughing and joking with the jury, with others in the courtroom. There was a few occasions where the whole courtroom burst into laughter because Fritz was just so goddamn funny. And it's like, people, he's on trial for 27 murders. There is nothing funny about him. And unbelievably, the jury actually warmed to his character. They thought that he was warm and likable and trustworthy. And I'm like, trustworthy? A murderer, a serial killer is trustworthy. Those two words should not be in the same sentence. But there was one thing that really annoyed Fritz during the trial, and that was that there was too many women in the courtroom. He even asked the judge to remove the women from the courtroom, and the judge promptly said, sorry, I have no control over them, which I just thought was very funny. At one point as well, Fritz said that he was incredibly bored, and he asked for a cigar, which he was promptly given. I'm like, no! Why are we treating him like this? He is a serial killer. You do not give him a cigar. Throughout the trial, Fritz went into unnecessarily graphic detail about all of the murders, which is just plain and clear that he was loving it, and he was reliving the murders as he was telling them, and he was probably getting off on the shock and disgust of the jury and the others in the courtroom. He was probably also getting sexually aroused as he was describing his sexual assaults and biting into Adam's apples and drinking blood. He also went into a lot of detail about the dismembering, which was apparently his least favourite part of the murders, but he's definitely not acting like it. However, Fritz also denied some of the murders that he was being charged with. He also denied selling human meat, which again, the truth over this whole dodgy meat situation is still unknown to this very day. I mean, was it animals or was it human? We just don't know. And the jury thought that because Fritz was so forthcoming about everything, and they trusted him when he said that he didn't murder some of the victims. He's just manipulating everyone into doing what he wants. And there was one other notable thing from the trial, and that is that Fritz completely turned on his sidekick Hans, whom he was apparently in love with. He started spewing false accusations about Hans, making up lies that Hans himself had committed some of the murders, even though that was not the truth. Hans is guilty, don't get me wrong. He is complicit in most, if not all, of these murders. However, he never committed the murders himself. But because the jury trusted Fritz, they believed him. And also, Hans, he was a different kind of character to Fritz in the trial. Hans was very quiet, he was very reserved, he didn't really show much emotion, and he wasn't very likable. So the jury thought that he was more dangerous, more quiet, in comparison to the likable, charming Fritz. Fritz also told the jury that it was Hans' fault for all of the murders. He told the jury, quote, Hans could have saved me, but he chose not to. And Fritz and Hans would get into huge public arguments during the trial, which only made the case worse for Hans. And by the end of the trial, Fritz Harman was found guilty of 24 out of the 27 murders. He was found not guilty on the other 3 due to technicalities, although it is still widely believed that he did commit these murders, if not many more that he wasn't even charged with. And his accomplice, Hans Grantz, was found guilty of being an accessory to many of the murders. But on top of this, because of all of Fritz's lies about Hans, he was also found guilty for one victim for incitement of murder, which carried a much heavier sentence. So because of this, both Fritz Harman and Hans Grantz were both sentenced to death. And this is the outcome that Fritz was expecting. He actually stood up on the dock and loudly shouted, "I accept this verdict fully and freely. I shall go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." And Hans just completely broke down. He was hysterical. And he's definitely guilty. I'm not saying that, but he has been sentenced to death for crimes that he didn't commit. And then just 4 months later, at 6 o'clock in the morning, on the 15th of April 1925, Fritz Harman was executed first. He was led to the guillotine. He was asked if he had any last wishes, where he said that he wanted an expensive cigar and a Brazilian coffee, which he was given both, and then he was beheaded. But now this is where this case has one final twist, because shortly after a member of the public found a letter written by Fritz, and this letter was addressed to Hans's father. And in this letter, Fritz said that Hans was completely innocent, that all of the stories that he had told in the trial about Hans participating in the murders, they were all made up. But then there was also another letter found, written by Fritz, addressed to the police. And this letter said, quote, "You won't kill me. I'll be back. Yes, I shall be amongst you for all eternity. And now you yourselves have also killed. You should know it. Hans Grantz was innocent. Well, how's your conscience now? Twisted mind games. That is what he is playing. Twisted mind games from beyond the grave." Fritz is basically saying that he is laughing at the police because now the police are no better than him, because the police have also killed an innocent person, being Hans Grantz. And he's saying that he will now haunt these police officers forever because they are now killers themselves. However, Fritz didn't realize that he would be executed first, and these letters were found before Hans was executed. So now Hans went for a retrial, and Hans Grantz was now sentenced to 12 years in prison for being a knowing accomplice and accessory to the murders. And Hans served his sentence, got released, and lived all the way until 1975, when he died of old age. And in the aftermath of this case, Fritz's brain was actually removed after his execution to be studied. And unbelievably, he was kept in a German university to be studied all the way until 2014. So this brain was kept and studied, and it was in storage for like 90 years. And then it was cremated in 2014. And as for Fritz's victims, as many of their remains were recovered as possible, and they were buried together in a communal grave in a cemetery in Hanover, which is still there to this very day. And given the fact that this case happened so long ago, I mean, it did happen like 100 years ago, pretty much exactly, 100 years ago. We don't really know anything about the victims. We pretty much only know their names. But it must have just been such a scary time to live in Hanover, with the victims on the loose. And like how was the time to live this killed in the most brutal and sadistic way. And that was the case of Fritz Harman, the vampire of Hanover, /the butcher of Hanover. So as always, let me know your thoughts, theories, and opinions.
online school has definitely changed our daily structure. It's so much more relaxed.
Zara Claire Baker was born on November 16, 1999 in New South Wales, Australia, about halfway between Sydney and Melbourne. Zara's parents, Adam Baker and Emily Dietrich, were fairly young. Emily was only 9 months after Zara's birth, and she struggled with postpartum depression for the first 8 months of Zara's life, and ultimately relinquished custody to Adam and seemingly disappeared. Zara grew to become a happy, bubbly little girl with brown hair, blue eyes, and a radiant smile. Adam lived with his parents after gaining custody of Zara, and Adam's mother, Karen Baker, helped care for her granddaughter while Adam was working. They all moved to Giro, Queensland in 2004 for a job that Adam got in a sugar mill. Giro, Queensland is a fairly small town with around 400 residents in the northeast part of the country on the Coral Sea coast.
Oh.
At 5 years old, Zara was diagnosed with bone cancer. She began treatments, but ultimately most of her left leg had to be amputated. You'd think this would be pretty devastating to a 5-year-old girl, but not for Zara. The ever-positive child said, "It's okay, because I'm going to be getting a Barbie leg, so I don't want you to be upset." Hospital staff, friends, and family remarked that even after the amputation, she was always happy. They remember her flying around the cancer ward on her crutches to greet other children and cheer them up. She would also hop from room to room on one leg with a big smile on her face to make everyone laugh. Unfortunately, 2 years later, at the age of 7, it was found that cancer had spread and was in her lungs. She began aggressive chemotherapy treatment and had surgery to remove part of her lung. The chemo treatments resulted in Zara losing most of her hearing. She was left needing hearing aids. She continued to receive treatments and checkups for several years after that.
Zara loved spending time with her grandparents and friends, and continued to be the brave, outgoing little girl that she had always been. She did a lot of swimming as part of her recovery, and also loved climbing rock walls. Everyone was amazed with how agile and capable she was, despite the loss of her leg. Unfortunately for Zara, things would not stay this way. In 2008, at the age of 33, Zara's father Adam met someone new online. Adam had a profile on IMV, which stands for Instant Messaging Virtual Universe. This is a social entertainment platform where people can connect through 3D avatar-based experiences. On this site, Adam met Elisa Fairchild, who described herself as a 40-something gothic fairy. Her avatar depicted her with red angel wings. They struck up an online romance, and not long after, Elisa left North Carolina and moved across the world to be with him in Australia.
Elisa, also known as Lisa, moved in with Adam, Zara, and Adam's parents. At this time, Elisa had 3 adult children that stayed behind in the U.S. Now, right from the start, Adam's parents did not like Elisa. Despite this, they were married just a few short months later. And not long after, she began pressuring Adam to move back to North Carolina with her. Adam's parents were very much against this move. Zara was still receiving treatments and getting checkups with her oncology team in Australia, all of which were free. Karen Baker was worried that if they moved to the U.S., Zara's treatments would become too expensive. Lisa claimed to be from a very wealthy family who would cover all of Zara's medical bills. This, unfortunately, turned out to be a complete lie. Adam's parents were unable to change his mind, and he continued making plans to move. Before leaving for America, the local community teamed up to buy Zara a wheelchair and a new laptop so that she could complete her school assignments in America. Zara, who loved the Army, also had a memorable experience with the Australian military before she left for her new home. She got to sit in an armored vehicle with a helmet on and pose for photos with soldiers. Her grandmother said her eyes couldn't have been any bigger. Zara had previously attended a camp for children with cancer where she completed obstacle courses and had to climb ropes. The other campers had been very impressed with her enthusiasm and determination to complete every obstacle with only one leg. Getting this final experience with the soldiers in Australia was a dream come true for Zara.
Zara, Adam, and Elisa moved to Hickory, North Carolina to live with Elisa's father. Initially, Zara was very happy and made friends quickly. Unfortunately, her cancer treatment stopped due to a lack of money. Adam, who had come to the U.S. on a temporary visa, was unable to get a job due to his immigration status. After 6 months, Elisa's dad kicked them out. So in mid-2009, they moved into a new apartment in Granite Falls, North Carolina. Now,
Neighbors at this apartment later said they could hear Adam and Elisa arguing all of the time. They could also hear noises coming from the attic. They did not realize until later that the noises they were hearing came from Zara, who had been locked in the attic with nothing but a sheet to sleep on. Unfortunately, they didn't make that connection until a few months later, when Adam and Elisa were kicked out due to unpaid rent, and the noises stopped.
Next, they moved into a trailer in nearby Hudson. Sometime before the move to Hudson, several reports were made to the Department of Social Services on Zara's behalf. Zara's school teachers were very concerned about her. She constantly came to school with bruises. On one occasion, after having a bathroom accident at school, Zara broke down crying because she didn't want Elisa to find out. Her teachers were so concerned that they visited Zara's home on 2 separate occasions, and one teacher even gave Zara her personal phone number to use in case of an emergency. The teachers at her school were diligently logging the abuse. Unfortunately, it was not taken seriously by DSS. On 4 separate occasions, neighbors also made reports to DSS. Unfortunately, Elisa and Adam pulled Zara from school and moved around a lot. As we have heard in previous cases, when families cross county lines, it often means that children fall through the cracks. When the family moved to Hudson, Zara was enrolled in school, but she never attended. Elisa claimed to have been homeschooling her, but there was no evidence of this actually happening.
Meanwhile, it seemed that Elisa was getting jealous of Zara's medical condition. She claimed that she had beaten brain cancer and had surgery to remove several tumors. She also downplayed the seriousness of Zara's condition and deliberately punished her in ways that exploited her disabilities. Elisa made Zara run up and down a hill behind their trailer for extended periods of time. On one occasion, 2 teenage girls that lived in the same trailer park witnessed this punishment. They saw Zara crying while she attempted to continue running while Elisa was screaming at her. When they tried to intervene, Elisa turned her verbal abuse towards them and threatened to whip their butts. When the mother of one of the girls came out to see what was going on, Elisa retreated into her trailer. Now, this was not the only form of abuse or neglect that was directed at Zara. A family member claimed that when they visited the Baker residence, Zara was constantly locked in her room. They said that she was only allowed out for 5 minutes a day to eat. In addition, if Zara did not finish her meal, Elisa would beat her, which again was witnessed by family members. When asked if Adam took part, the family member noted that Adam never laid a finger on Zara, but he also did not stop Elisa. One time, in an attempt to hit Zara, Elisa missed and hit her prosthetic leg, breaking her own hand instead. This shows the level of strength she was using when hitting this little girl. Elisa's own daughters witnessed the beatings that Zara was enduring, and they reported Elisa to Child Protective Services. In the first half of 2010, CPS came to their home on 4 separate occasions. Unfortunately, they seemed to believe Elisa's lies that Zara was just clumsy due to her prosthetic leg. All the injuries were explained away, and the case was closed in August of 2010.
Before we continue with Zara's story, let's back up and talk a little about Elisa's history. This was not the first time she was reported to CPS. In fact, reports involving her own children dated back as far as 1999. In addition, Elisa had a bizarre marriage history. We don't want to go into all of the details here as they're long and pretty convoluted, but here's the summary. Elisa had been married 6 times by the time she met Adam Baker, making Adam her 7th husband. She did not always divorce one husband before marrying the next. So at one point, she was married to 3 different men. This later led to a bigamy charge against Elisa. She undoubtedly had a type when she was on the hunt for a new man. Every man that Elisa married was either physically or emotionally disadvantaged. She had a habit of marrying men very quickly after meeting them. She would then take advantage of them financially and often be emotionally abusive for relationship and being them financially brutal. At least one husband came forward to explain why they were getting married so long. But he wanted to see her out of the abuse he endured at home. It's easier to just stay married than risk another abusive encounter with him. It's also important to note that with all the changes in her marriage and the fact that Elisa sometimes used an alias, she was very hard to track down. One known alias that she used was Dawn Michelle. Elisa was abusive and manipulative to more than just her strange husband, her own children, and her stepdaughter. Long before Adam and Zara came into the picture, she pretended that her own daughter had cancer. She would push her around for a wheelchair or another way to exploit Elisa had lived at 47 different addresses. By 2008, she'd accrued a long history of unpaid rent and utilities from these various rental homes. At the time that Elisa met Adam, she was still married to her most recent husband named Aaron Young. However, Adam was not aware of any previous marriages. Both Elisa and Aaron were still active IMDb members and interacted through that platform and in person. In fact, Adam even met Aaron, but Aaron was introduced as Elisa's brother.
In early September of 2010, the family settled back in Hickory, North Carolina. Adam got a job working for a tree maintenance company, and his boss, Mark Coffey, provided him with a home to live in, as well as a company vehicle. This property was also used as a staging site for the tree company because there were large piles of wood chips in the backyard. Adam's new job consisted of very long hours. He often left before Zara was awake and returned after she was in bed. This left Elisa as her primary caregiver. In the 6 to 8 weeks that they lived there, the neighbors never saw Zara. In fact, they didn't even know that a child lived in the house. On October 9, 2010, a 911 call was made by Elisa Baker reporting a fire in their yard. Elisa claimed to wake up to see flames out the windows. Emergency services responded to what was supposed to be a grass fire, and turned out to be a fire burning in the piles of wood chips. While the fire was being dealt with, someone noted that the door to Adam's work truck was open, and a strong smell of gasoline was coming from inside. There was also an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. Upon further inspection, this turned out to be a ransom note. The note said, quote, "Mr. Coffey, you like being in control. Now who is in control? We have your daughter, and your pot-smoking redhead son is next unless you do what is asked. $1 million unmarked. We'll be in touch soon," end quote. Written multiple times in the paper were the words, "No cops." Police officers contacted Mark Coffey and confirmed that both of his children were home and well. This baffled police, and nothing further was done about this information. About 9 hours later, a second 911 call was made from the Baker residence. This time it was Adam, calling to report that Zara was missing. During the phone call, Adam sounded very calm, and even made a joke about Zara nearing puberty. He also divulged there had been a ransom note at their house that morning, and that the kidnappers must have taken the wrong child by accident. The police issued an Amber Alert for Zara, describing her as 10 years old, 5 feet 1 inch tall, 85 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes.
I'm going to sleep, y'all. Good night.
Your small business with expert guidance.
Good night, King.
With Myberg.
Not done with the room yet, but right now we are.
Right now during our President's Day sales event, save up to $800 on Stearns & Foster and Timber Feet.
Ricky's truck is having trouble starting, but he went to AutoZone, where a friendly AutoZoner tests and charges his battery, all for free.
Good night, y'all.
Switch to